My name is Frank LaRue, and I am currently the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Opinion and Expression of the United Nations. I would like to give some basic principles of freedom of expression around the world. First of all, this freedom is a freedom that is exercised in two dimensions: the freedom of information, access to information, and then the freedom of expression. I believe that freedom of expression or freedom of information is one of the principal aspects of any democratic society. And here is where freedom of the press plays a very important role. Because of all the characteristics that a democracy has, a strong legal framework or a strong justice system and the rule of law or a strong electoral system, I think the most important aspect of a democracy is citizen participation and active participation by its citizens. And that depends entirely on the level of information that individuals and citizens receive in a particular country. And in that sense, the idea of having a free press that can inform the population is crucial. And also the freedom to access information of a public nature so citizens can actually monitor the state and guarantee transparency. Here there's one basic principle that I would like to insist that we apply: the principle of diversity and plurality. Society, in order to build their own thoughts and opinions, need to have access to a diversity of media and a plurality of points of view. And this is why we always challenge and confront the idea of huge conglomerates of media or of monopolies and oligopolies. That, I think, violates this right of the population. So it's very important. But also important in the diversity is not only to have a diversity of media, but also to have access to alternative media. We a crucial point of view, especially in very poor societies, is to have community media, community newspapers, community broadcasting, radio and television, and local media. And this is again especially important in those societies that have indigenous population or cultural, ethnical or religious minorities. So everyone will have the right to find some venue to express their culture, their language, their thoughts, their ideas, their political opinions of any nature. Finally, freedom of expression, whether it be of individuals or whether it be of the press, should not be censored in any way, never by political mechanisms of the state, nor by the use of criminal law. We believe that defamation should become a civil action and not a criminal action, because a criminal action has a chilling effect and actually intimidates the use of expression. And I believe that defamation should never be used by public officials in exercise of their public office to silence criticism. Public office goes hand in hand with public scrutiny. This is what we call transparency, and public scrutiny has to go hand in hand with public criticism. So public officials anywhere in the world should be open to that criticism as a form of democracy, as part of the checks and balances of democracy, and never try to limit it by the use of law or of any other mechanism. Finally, I think the state also has a proactive role in protecting freedom of speech. It's not only the passive obligation of no censorship, but it's also the active role of protecting. There are many countries where there are serious acts of violence against journalists. And I find that in many countries there is initially the question of whether an act of violence was derived from their role as journalists or motivated by their professional career as journalists. I think you cannot prejudge a case before it's investigated. Any act of violence against a journalist has to be investigated just because of the fact that it's a journalist, and that the state has an obligation, as they do with human rights defenders, to give journalists a special protection. Therefore, there cannot be pre-given judgments or conclusions. That has to be the result of the investigation. Any case has to be investigated, because the worst possible outcome is to leave impunity to prevail. Every case that remains in impunity is the invitation for further actions of violence to occur. And finally, I believe that in telecommunications, it is very important that the state regulates the use of frequencies of radio, television, in in the analog way that they are now, but especially in the digital transition. But I also believe that there has to be a reserve of these frequencies for the poor sectors, or for minorities, or for indigenous communities. They cannot be granted only to commercial interests. I think we have allowed in the world an excessive commercial view of communication. Yes, I think commercial media plays an important role, deserves equal protection and freedom, but I think states have the obligation to create a small reserve that can be used by community broadcasting or by public broadcasting as a public service, a non-profitable public service. And this has to be guaranteed by creating a regulation that establishes some balances and equity in the use of those frequencies, and some mechanisms for all sectors to access these frequencies. Frequencies are limited good, but they have to be distributed, that's why, in a fair and equitable way. And I believe that this has to be done by a regulatory body that is independent, that is a state body, but not dependent on the executive branch. And this is one of the most difficult recommendations, because all states have a regulatory body, but normally they're not independent. And we're encouraging states around the world to have that regulatory body become independent. I think it's important in the legislation, the same way that there has to be a decriminalization of speech, of freedom of speech and expression and of the press. There has to be a decentralization of the regulatory bodies on freedom of expression. Finally, I would say it's also important to analyze the use of official publicity. That is the new form of censorship. A state has the right to spend resources in publicity, in information to the public, but has to assign that publicity again with a sort of regulation that will allow a fair and active way to do it. You cannot privilege the media that is sympathetic and sanction the media that is critical to public officials or policies. It has to be granted on a different basis. So the public expenditure, the official public expenditure on public communication cannot be discriminatory, and there has to be regulations and legislation in that manner. Those are the crucial issues and principles that I'm trying to insist. And very, very much at the end, the new mechanisms, the new technologies of communication, like the internet, have to be protective. Freedom have to be exercised. We should not include, I think there are responsibilities for those that use it unwisely in criminal activities, and that can be criminalized, like child pornography. But it's not good to have censorship mechanisms which can be circumvented anyway. I think it's more important to combat organized crime as a criminal activity directly and not through the censorship mechanisms. But an added element, and this is very important for me in the developing world, is that the same way we talk about access to the new technologies, we talk about creating that access for countries, entire countries, the transfer of technology from developed societies to developing nations, but also to create access to the poorest sectors of society. There's no sense in speaking about freedom over the internet if an entire community or region does not have access to the internet, does not have a computer, a laptop, or a service provider. I think this is the new challenge in our time, how we can guarantee access to everyone to these new technologies of communication so everyone can enjoy freedom of communication and freedom of expression. Thank you.